I've received a lot of comments in my earlier videos asking about the dinghy that I used to sail from Ipswich to Norway and across the North Sea in, so I thought I might as well make that video, seeing as there seemed to be a demand for it. This is my boat, and she's called Fandango, and if you're watching this video, then you've probably already seen some of the footage from the trip, and you've noticed that she probably isn't a standard class of dinghy. There's many cruising dinghies out there, but she isn't like any of them really, and it'd be reasonable to ask why I didn't just go for one of the standard designs, because there are excellent dinghies already out there, but those designs are designed for wider market appeal, and you inevitably end up with a fairly conservative design. While I think the sort of conservative approach is safest for most people's dinghy cruising, for myself I favour sort of faster and, well, maybe more frisky designs, which I actually think can be safer. Firstly, I think that I will be in safety of a sheltered harbour long before a slow, safe boat, which means they'll still be out there fighting in a storm that I wouldn't be in. And you might think that getting away from the situation is all very well and good, but that you're going to have bad weather at some point, and you might think that a fast and nimble dinghy would fare a lot worse than a solid, steady alternative. But again, I'm of the opinion that, well, there is a compromise, obviously, but I would rather have something towards the fast and agile end of the spectrum, because if handled correctly, a fast and agile boat can be steered to avoid the sort of worst waves, the breakers, and I'm certain that I would have been battered around far worse by the sea state I had if I'd been in a slower boat. Another thing that I wanted in the boat, which is a bit different from normal, a side effect of the stability and volume and sort of bulkiness of most cruising dinghies, means that they don't row well, and they are forced to carry an outboard. I think on such a long voyage, they become a liability. So I can achieve 5 knots by rowing for a short period. If I really need to get out of something, I'll be able to hold 4 knots for half an hour to an hour, and then if I'm rowing for the whole day, then I'll work on a 3 knot average. The hull is based on a Whitehall rowing skiff, so she is narrow and easily driven, especially at the slower speeds that you'd kind of expect for rowing. But what does surprise people is how fast she'll go at the sort of higher end that this type of hull isn't usually associated with. And there's been lots of people fairly incredulous when I say that I've exceeded 10 knots while surfing on a very regular basis, and I've averaged over 8 knots when measured over an hour, and my top speed of all time is just 14 knots, which is pretty speedy for what's traditionally considered to be a displacement hull. And I have actually done some of my own investigations on a sort of low level using appendages on the rudder or at the stern to improve performance. But for the full-size boat, I actually decided against going for an adjustable hydrofoil on the rudder on the basis of simplicity and durability. Instead, I did have a little tab just above the waterline, so that when you're going slow at sort of rowing speeds, it's clear of the water, so it's not creating any more drag, and it only comes into contact with the water once you start going faster and the boat starts squatting down a little bit. I did some tests on plates on top of the rudder like this, and it did lower the resistance, just not to the same extent. But in terms of an alternative that's more durable and just simpler, it's a compromise. So for the rig, I went with a generous, really sized Bermudan yawl, or ketch, depending on what your definition you use, but that's an argument for another day. And there are simpler rigs out there, for sure, but for this application, I think it's the best. It means you can reduce sail in literally seconds and still have a balanced rig with a low centre of effort. So just by dropping the main, I can drop the main in 5-10 seconds, and there's no faffing around with bits of string and cold hands trying to tie knots or pleat things off. So I actually did many more miles than I expected with just the mizzen, even. Not just the jib and mizzen, but just the mizzen alone, when it got especially fruity. I found that running off under the mizzen was a better option than going for bare spars, because it gave some speed to steer around the nasty waves, and meant I could sail at a much wider variation of angles. If you're just running under bare spars, you can only go downwind or pretty close to it. Whereas with the mizzen, I found that if I just kicked the centreboard back to move the centre of lateral resistance aft, I could actually sail a little bit above a beam reach. So I could, in flat water, I could actually make way to windward with just the mizzen, which is quite a handy trick to have at your sleeve if the going gets tough. I also often just left the mizzen up while riding at anchor, just to keep the boat pointing into the wind. And on a few occasions, I actually sheeted the mizzen off-centre so the boat lay at an angle to the wind, in order to line it up with waves sort of coming in through the mouth of the bay or whatever, if the wind and the waves weren't quite aligned. So that was really handy to have the mizzen for. And another thing I used it for, which I hadn't anticipated, was that when I broke the centreboard, I had to sail over 50 miles without a centreboard, and I found that by oversheeting the mizzen, I could generate a load of weather helm, which let me sail with a greater angle than the rudder, and so I could generate far more lateral resistance with the rudder. And if I hadn't had a mizzen, I couldn't have set it up like that as easily, and still had a sort of mainsail driving properly. I could keep on waxing lyrical about mizzens, but just suffice to say that for serious cruising, I think it's honestly the rig that's going best. And if I put my feelings for mizzen in love letters and poetry, my wife would probably get jealous, so I'd better move on. And on the sort of less extreme end of the spectrum, having a large rig like this meant you can keep a decent pace in light winds and avoid using the oars at all costs, especially with the spinnaker up. She can glide along almost suspiciously fast. So in anything above about 10 knots of breeze, it does mean that I have to use the trapeze if I want to hold on to full rig, and I can hold that full rig until about 20 knots from the trapeze if I play the main, but it does get very physical. But by the time I'm forced to get the main down, the jib and mizzen combination is then perfectly powered up, sitting on the side and hiking a bit, and I can go up to sort of 35 knots fairly comfortably, just sitting on the side. And at that point, the sea state is far more of a concern than wind for a small boat. So that in terms of the rig, I think it works very well for adaptability, and you've got so many choices for sail setup. And in more sort of gentle use, I have spent many happy hours sailing around with just the jib and mizzen. For this trip, I had a smaller set of sails. The main jib and mizzen were all smaller than the ones I've used normally, so I did have a bit less power, but in terms of using the sail area a little bit for expecting quite strong winds, that worked out quite well. And then in terms of sheeting the sails, jib sheets come down through the deck and come out under the oars to the cleat, which keeps it all nice and clean and tidy. As I said, for this trip, the sails were smaller than my normal set, so the lead angle on jib wasn't actually ideal. The full-size jib works far better. I could probably have installed some kind of tweaker if I'd had more time before I set off, but it worked good enough. Then the main sheet is a pretty standard centre main setup. There's a traveller across the back of the cockpit and a swivel on the back of the centreboard case, just like most dinghies. The mizzen is arranged in a way that I haven't actually seen on any other boat. It's sheeted to this bridle at the stern, which is split and adjustable at either end, which kind of virtually acts as a traveller, so you can adjust where it's being sheeted to. And then the mizzen sheet is split and goes down through the deck on one side of the mast to a cleat just by the tiller. It works really well, actually, and this arrangement means that you can take the boom off and bring it into the cockpit without really releasing the mizzen sheet. This block just slides along pretty easily. You can pull the whole sail into the cockpit without unclipping anything. Just before I move on to the more cruising specific features, I'd better just mention more about the general construction. I know that people are going to ask about that. The hull is strip planked in 1/2-inch Western red cedar, and then I sheathed it inside and out with 300-gram biaxial glass. And that overlaps across the sort of wide keel plank, which is 1-inch thick sapele. So the whole skin itself is pretty bulletproof. I was probably a bit overkill on that. I could tone that down a bit and make the boat a bit lighter. And then the decks are 6mm ply, marine ply, with a 3mm decorative veneer on top, which is completely unnecessary, but I couldn't resist. And then either end of the cockpit there's watertight bulkheads, and then these 4 little half bulkhead areas under the side deck, which have double roles supporting the deck and holding the oars, because it's one of my pet hates in a cruising dinghy, that the oars are usually in the way and people sit on them and they're over the thwart, you climb over them and they get battered. So I made sure there was specific storage for them out of the way. Then the centreboard case in the middle of the cockpit doesn't have a thwart across to support it, and that keeps the cockpit really clear. You can chuck a load of people in there. Works very nicely. Instead of being supported by the thwart, the case is supported by a knee, well, a couple of knees, from the sole, and the sole's a solid structure that's built into the boat. And under the sole there's a couple of inches of seal buoyancy, and in the sole then there's these 4 bilge sumps that are connected with limber tubes, so the bilge water can either get to the self-bailers in the midships, or in the front bilge sump there's an electric bilge pump that empties out the side. One of the complications of a mizzen on a small boat is working the steering around it. And I went through the approach of a yoke on the rudder and a yoke attached on the tiller in the cockpit, and these are connected by these rods which incorporate a turnbuckle, which means I can tighten them and put the whole thing under tension, so there is no slop whatsoever, which there so often is with this kind of arrangement. In terms of more specifically cruising features for the boat, the tent is obviously one of the most important. if you're going to be spending over 100 days living aboard, as I did. And I had the tent in mind right from the beginning of designing the cockpit coaming. Initially, a few years ago, I did make a quick tent that just clipped onto the boom, but there really wasn't enough space underneath it. And I always had in mind that for a longer trip, I'd make a tent as I had intended from the start. So what I've got is it has these 4 fiberglass battens that I made to match the curve of the front of the coaming. The whole tent fits neatly bundled up around it when the tent's down. The front of it is held down with elastic, and then the front 2 battens pivot up, and then the aft 2 battens clip into these little sockets in the coamings. I couldn't actually find anything that did what I wanted in terms of these clips, so I came up with this design and made them out of stainless, and they work really well actually. You have to bend the batten a bit to get them into the socket, and then the tension of the bent batten keeps them in place. And I had over 35 knots on the beam a couple of times, which got me worried about the poles snapping or coming out or whatever, but they survived that absolutely fine, so I'm pretty happy with how robust it turned out to be. And it's very quick to put up. I wish I had timed it, but it's easily less than 30 seconds to put up, which is really nice when you arrive somewhere in the rain and you can almost instantly be sort of sheltered to some extent. And then inside the tent is this sleeping platform, which made from all these panels, and it takes apart, and all those sections fit into the forward locker. It's all made from foam core fiberglass, so it's very light. I usually put all my kit onto the platform when I was sort of in sleeping mode, so that meant that all this area at the stern was completely empty, so I could sit with my sort of feet over the end and sort of cook on the stove, which worked really nicely. I kept my sleeping mats rolled up, strapped either side, and that did mean they got wet, but there isn't much I could do about that. And I think becoming one with the wetness is an essential part of dinghy cruising, unfortunately. I originally intended to take all of the platform out for every day of sailing and put it in the locker, but I found that the forward section was actually quite useful for sitting onto row and tying things to. Yeah, I just left it in, meant there was one less thing to fit into the forward locker. Then the other cruising feature that people seem to obsess over nowadays is the galley box. And I know people have had elaborate chests with drawers and compartments. Mine is just literally a simple box to hold the stove on top falling over. Obviously, it isn't waterproof and it fills up when you capsize, but it's just a gas stove, so it never came to any harm. For keeping all my electronics charged, I have these 2 solar panels on the foredeck. They are 20 watts each, and they provide plenty of power for everything I needed. They connect via a charge controller to a small 24 amp hour lithium battery. They kept the battery completely charged on pretty much all the days. There are a couple where it was really dull and raining all day, but the battery could do me for almost a week by itself, so I was never in any danger of running out of power. It's a fairly simple electric system. It just powers some USB sockets for charging phone and tablet. Got charging cradle for charging the VHF, and it also powers the bilge pump and the navigation lights. I only installed the panels for this trip, so I am hoping I can remove them without damaging the deck too badly, because I do think they spoil the look of the boat a bit. For previous trips, shorter trips, I just have a very small solar panel that clips onto the cover, so I didn't actually need to charge for just a couple of days away. The battery's more than enough, and then the very small solar panel just trickle charge when I left the boat. No doubt there's some details that I've left out from this section that some of you will find interesting, so feel free to ask in the comments and I will try to respond, but I can't make any promises of a swift reply. I'm not very good at that kind of thing. I mentioned earlier that before setting off across the North Sea, I've done 2,000 miles to wheedle out some weak links, so thought it might be good to go through those weak links that I did find, so all the breakages I suffered along the way, to just address what I'd do differently and if I could have done anything to change them. So the first breakage I had was just a minor one. It was the mast base, mast foot fitting, just came loose. It had been solid for years, but I guess just using it every single day and just the number of sea miles just finally worked it loose. It was a fairly easy fix. I just epoxied a G10 fiberglass backing plate over the already existing ply one under the deck. It was a bit of a faff repairing it while at anchor, and it must have looked a complete disaster to anyone who saw me with the mast down. And then the next breakage I had was a bit more serious. For anyone watching who isn't familiar with boats, this isn't what a rudder should look like. So this happened while I was surfing down a wave just a couple of miles off Aberystwyth on the Welsh coast. So we were surfing down a wave, maybe 10 or 12 knots, when there was just a clunk as something hit the rudder and a nasty crunching sound as it ripped it off. I didn't see what it was that we hit. It was below the water, so I don't really know how it hit the rudder and not the centreboard, because I would have thought it would hit the centreboard first, but it didn't. I'd thought that the rudder would be very well protected because the rudder itself is behind the hull. The only bit that protrudes out is the drop plate, which can obviously kick up out of the way. So the only way I can see that anything could have any sort of impact on the rudder is to have caught on this little corner of the drop plate. It's solid fiberglass, so there's not a mark to show, but that's the only thing I can think it was. And I was actually a bit surprised that it broke the entire rudder rather than just pulling the fittings out the transom. But then I realised that actually the rudder is being additionally held to the transom by the rods connecting to the tiller yoke under tension. So actually it's a distant tangential benefit of the mizzen that the rudder is actually held onto the boat more securely. I managed to retrieve the broken piece of the rudder in our Bristol boatyard was very helpful and let me use tools and a workbench to glass it all back together. I did lose the fiberglass spring that I'd made to hold the plate down, so for the rest of the trip the plate was kicked up constantly, which puts far more stress on the rudder. But despite that, and it being a bit of a bodged repair, the rudder was fine for the whole of the trip. So I think I have to conclude that it was a bit of an unlucky fluke to have hit something at a weird angle. The next one I had was far more predictable. It was when I was sailing from southwest Scotland to Northern Ireland across the Irish Sea, a section called North Channel, which is a nasty piece of water, and it was about 20 knots. So it was the top end of what it could hold full sail while I was on the trapeze. So I was low on the trapeze and playing the main quite hard. I had tried sailing earlier in the day with less sail, but the chop was quite steep, so I just needed the power to punch through the waves, keep going upwind, and I also wanted to get into Belfast Lough before the tide turned against us, so I was pushing quite hard. And we were going along, and 1 second I was sailing along fast and spray flying everywhere. And the next I was in the water while the boat was sailing off without me, and I was in the water. I was holding on to the main sheet, so the boat went away and capsized, and I sort of swam back to the boat. But my trapeze harness had snapped, and that was why I'd ended up in the water. I got the boat back up and kept going, but I had to go down to jib and mizzen because I didn't have a trapeze harness anymore because it had fallen off while I was swimming back to the boat. So not having the trapeze harness, I don't know exactly what failed, but it had been stitched back together a few times, and it was a battered and frayed old thing. It's not something I thought was a safety critical piece of equipment, but that's not a mistake I will make again. I say that, but the next equipment failure was also similarly predictable. It was one of my oars, which I made them over 10 years ago now, and I've never given them much love. I do carry spare paddles, so it wasn't a huge issue, but in a separate situation, it could potentially have been dangerous. Next up, in terms of breakages, was another biggie. It was while I was entering Sound of Islay, one of the Scottish islands. There's a lot of tide going through there, but as I was entering, there was quite big waves. Again, common theme here. I was surfing down a wave, probably doing 10 knots or more, and there seemed to be a wave that came from a completely different angle. I think it had reflected back off the cliffs, so it kind of acted as a bit of a ramp, as it were, as we surfed down the first wave, and it felt like the whole boat came clear of the water. I wish I had video footage to work out what exactly happened, but as we landed at a weird angle in the trough of the wave, there was a huge crunch, and the boat felt really strange. So I dropped the main and furled the jib and hove to investigate. And after sort of searching around quite thoroughly, I found that we had a distinct lack of a centreboard, which might have been the issue. It just snapped cleanly at the bottom of the hull. The original board, which had snapped, was made from 25mm thick marine ply, filled with lead, sheathed with fiberglass, and it had a few layers of Kevlar or aramid down the front. It probably would have held up to any amount of normal dinghy sailing, but that's not exactly my forte. Keep me sailing, I had to sail 50 miles to Oban without the centreboard, which was an interesting exercise, I think it's fair to say. In Oban, I sketched what I needed on the side of my galley box using a Sharpie, and using that sketch, I managed to get what I needed cut out of just a flat plate of stainless steel, which it did the job. I can say from experience, bitter experience, how badly a boat sails with a flat plate compared to a properly profiled board. So that's never something I will consider in the future. It's actually a remarkably short list of breakages, considering the number of miles and the weather I had. But honestly, that's the entire list. This isn't just sort of a list of the big things. The last thing on the list was a minor blip with the electronics, which, again, it was an entirely preventable one, and probably doesn't even count as a breakage. But the battery cable got disconnected by me knocking it as I shove things into the locker. I'd meant to make some boxing to protect it before I set off, but I didn't have time. The electronics were completely exposed inside the locker, so again, it's not an unpredictable thing. So I think overall she fared pretty well considering the abuse that I threw at her. Well, myself and the Scottish weather, I think it has to be said, threw at her. So obviously, having experienced a few breakages along the way, there's of course a few modifications that I would make. So I'm going to build version 4 rudder when I do have time. Main differences will be the slight change in the drop plate shape to remove this step, but I want to remove it just to get rid of that tiny chance that something could catch on it again. I'm also going to add larger plates rather than the little tabs that I had, and I'm also going to have a bit of twist to that shape just to better mirror the shape of the hull, which I reckon is going to have more efficiency, but I haven't sort of sat down and worked out the exact details on that. Another thing I haven't really worked out yet is I'm thinking of potentially putting a breakwater on the foredeck. I think one of those on Fandango would reduce slightly the amount of water getting into the cockpit. It wouldn't stop them completely, but it would do something rather than nothing. I might end up accepting that I can deal with being wet for the sake of having a boat that looks nice. Something a bit more major, this is probably something that's only to do on a future design, is I'd want to have a look at reducing the volume of the cockpit when it's flooded so that she can become agile again after capsizing and sort of get going quicker. It might sound simple to just have a smaller cockpit, but I don't want her to float higher when she's floating on her side capsized. It would make getting into the boat more difficult and getting onto the centreboard. And then also the open volume of the cockpit is really handy for stowing gear, and it just gives you more room to work with when you've got a lot of kit. I'm not sure if there is a way to do it. It's all a compromise. But another way that I can increase the speed that I can get going again is by adjusting bilge pump arrangement. So one of the easily made upgrades is that the model of bilge pump I used, there's a more powerful version of exactly the same pump available. So that's a bit of a no-brainer for swapping out for the more powerful pump. And staying on the subject of bilge pump, isn't currently a permanently installed manual bilge pump on my boat. The one that I have is a loose one. It was definitely the self-bailers that did the lion's share of bailing, and they handled the task admirably. But it wouldn't be too difficult to install some proper manual hand pumps under the side decks with their pickups in the sort of aft bilge sump. So I could meaningfully reduce the recovery times. And if I were building the boat again, I would make some changes to the forward bilge sump to make sure it's large enough to house 2 bilge pumps, one either side, mounted longitudinally. Because what I've currently got set up, the pumps mounted across the boat athwartships. So it's got the sensor at one end and the pickup at the other. So it meant that on one tack, the sensor detects water while the pickup is dry, and then on the other tack, when the pickup's in the water, the sensor is clear of the water. So in practice, this meant that when I was sailing, I just turned the bilge pump off and relied on the self-bailers. It meant as soon as I'd capsized, I had to faff around trying to reach for the switch panel. So I think altering the bilge pump arrangement in that way would make it so that you could leave it on and it would be far more effective, and you'd have 2 pumps. So redundancy has increased, which is always a good thing. On a different sort of topic, I'm going to put some air vents in the tent. Repeatedly, I had problems with condensation. So when it was raining, condensation would form inside the tent, and that would be shaken off by the wind, so it would effectively still be raining inside the tent, which wasn't so pleasant. But I think having some air vents would do a lot to alleviate that. And staying above deck, I'm wanting to expand my sail wardrobe a little with a mizzen staysail, so that would be set between the top of the mizzen and the base of the mainmast. It would add additional sail area for sort of light winds reaching, and it would also be an additional option for moderate heavy weather in combination with the jib and mizzen. So it would be kind of a midway between main up and main down, because there can sometimes be a kind of a dead zone between where it's too windy for the full main, and maybe it's a bit too big waves to want to be on the trapeze. So you just want a bit more sail area and a bit more power, but don't want to go the full main. And also the strong point that I'd have to put at the base of the mainmast would be a perfect place to finally get round adding a kicking strap. And then the demise of my old oars was actually an opportunity to change oars to what I see as a better type for what I wanted to do, because the old oars were spooned, which is more efficient for rowing, but it means they really can't be used as a sculling oar, to use one oar to scull over the stern, and also they are far less effective to use as a steering oar. So now I'm going to put a rollock socket in the top of the transom so I can use it to scull and steer off the back. The final thing that I would do differently next time is add more camera mounts and film more. There is so much I wish I had footage of from this trip. I wish I had footage of the worst conditions I came through, because what I've been able to film is only the bits that I felt comfortable sort of sailing one-handed and filming with the other. So if I had some camera mounts, I could have clipped the camera on and kept going through the worst stuff without having to think of safety first and then filming later. I'm guessing some of the people watching this, if you're watching this, you probably would have liked to see more of the bad weather. And even some of the mundane bits like rowing in and out of harbours just would have been nice as a record. So actually, there isn't anything major that I'd want to change about the boat. I think the fact that the boat made it all the way is pretty good evidence that she's a good enough boat. I now know her quirks as well as I think it's possible to really know the quirks of a boat. So it feels like they're a bit of an old married couple. But as I said before, I've no doubt left out some details that some of you are interested in, so do ask them in the comments and I will try to respond. But as I said, I can't make any promises on replying quickly, and I might have to add something in the description of the video if there are people asking the same question repeatedly. So do check before you comment, just so that we don't end up with the same question repeatedly in the comments, which I know is exactly the opposite of what you're supposed to say on a YouTube video, but I'm not doing this for views, so the algorithm can go do one for this. I will put a more detailed technical description of the boat in the description of the video, and also a kit list of everything I had on board, so if you're interested in that, have a look at that. And at the moment, I'm also in the process of tidying up and illustrating the log, so I might look at getting that published once I've finished, but I'm not making any promises on that. I'm tidying up firstly as just a record for myself, and we'll see if anyone's sort of interested once I've finished. And if you made it through to the end of the video, hopefully that means you found it interesting. So yeah, thank you for watching.